The table was set. The pastries were arranged. A white tablecloth dangled placidly in the early morning mist, surrounded by 12 golden, high-backed chairs. 5 decades ago, a dozen friends gathered here on the National Mall for breakfast. They wore morning coats and floor-length dresses, dined on oysters, drank champagne, and danced together as a string quartet played in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The extravagant scene on July the 19th, 1974, drew in a Washington Post photographer who captured the moment in an image that would ricochet around the country in newspaper reprints. But the people and the circumstances at the center of this famous picture remained a mystery to those who admired it, bought it, hung it on their office walls. They didn't know who these young people were or why they had gathered for such an ornate affair near the reflecting pool. They didn't know that the specter of death had loomed over the rousing celebration, or that the people in the center would go on to have a hand in many pivotal facets of American life. The civil rights movement, aid for the disabled, the blind, helping prison reform in the state of Maryland. Welcome, everyone, to my first podcast of this new year, 2025. On Grit Stories of Resilience, with the title this week, Dining on the Mall. 12 Friends, a New Year's resolution. Those are not my words that I started out with today. They are the written words by Marissa J, an enterprise reporter for the Washington Post, who posted her story in the early morning hours of September the 29th, 2024 on the WashingtonPost.com. It is the story of the background of this famous picture that was called by its photographer Breakfast on the Mall. While it became well known throughout the country and is treasured by the Washington Post as one of their most famous pictures ever taken, up there with pictures of the moon landing, President Reagan, President Kennedy and Eisenhower, Eleanor Roosevelt. No one knew much about this picture other than what it represented on its surface. 12 people having breakfast on the mall. I want to tell you today the background of this picture, who they were, and why they were there. The basis for my podcast, almost in its entirety, is the Washington Post story in September of last year by Marissa J. It's the background of this famous picture. In the 1960s, lots of people came to Washington wanting to work for the government, wanting to start new careers, coming from all over the country. Two such young people were Janet Hartley and Carolyn Busser, who were in their 20s and who had made their way here to Washington, D.C. from a small college in Minnesota. When they arrived, they had no place to live. They did go to the apartment of a friend of theirs from college who had no room, but did know another lady who had some room and suggested they check her out. This neighbor they checked out was Dorothy, she went by the name Dottie Whalen, who offered them a place to stay until they could find their own place, their own home. And these new acquaintances became friends, and as the years went by, almost family. Their group grew. Let's call them the group. They grew. They finally totaled 12 people in all who played together, vacationed together, did outlandish things together, played games together, explored the outdoors, celebrated together occasions. They had a costume party in which everybody came as a vegetable. They had a scavenger hunt through Rock Creek Park. They reveled in all their successes and commiserated in all their hardships. They were there for each other. They did not see it coming. You don't see things like this coming when you're in your 20s. You think that you will live forever, perhaps, or at least be young forever. Janet Hartley from Ohio by way of Minnesota College was just 27 years old when she was diagnosed with terminal breast cancer. The group thought that was about as horrible a medical diagnosis as anybody at that age could receive. It was about a month or so before her 28th birthday. In the summer of 74, when her friends were trying to figure out how to cheer her up, offer support, show their friendship and love for her. They didn't know what to do. They couldn't figure it out. Finally, a couple of them had an idea. Let's do something outrageous. Let's do something over the top that nobody would see that we would ever do. Let's have a meal, maybe a breakfast on the mall. How do you do that? Do you have to get permission? Her friend Carolyn Busser marched right into the National Park Service's headquarters and requested a permit for such a breakfast, a celebration of Janet's life. This is not what the Park Service thought was going to happen when she walked through the door. And the application process went all the way up to its director, who denied initially the request to have champagne for breakfast because they said there's no drinking allowed on the mall. Whereupon, Carolyn whipped out a photograph taken just a few weeks before of Rosemary Woods, then the secretary to President Nixon, drinking champagne at a picnic on the National Mall. Slowly and finally, but inevitably, the group got their permit, signed by that very director himself. So now we have permission. Now what are we going to do? They ordered limousines to pick everyone up that morning. Dress was to be formal, nothing informal. Formal invitations were sent out requesting their attendance. It was limited to just these 12. They hired a string quartet of 4 people, a catered meal. Her boyfriend, Janet's boyfriend, a young man named Wesley Collins, waited nearby to take his girlfriend to the mall for breakfast in the midst of the early morning in a horse-drawn carriage. What to wear? Because Janet did not know anything about this. She did not know what was going to happen. They had kept her not in the loop. That morning early, one of her roommates said, "Here, put this on." And they held out for her old prom dress from home, an item that her mother had shipped from Ohio without her daughter knowing. One of the men attending wore a long-tailed coat, vest and tie, just for the occasion. Another wore a top hat and gloves. Some carried canes. One was a naval officer and came in full dress uniform, sword and all. And when it was time to cut the pastries for dessert, he used his sword to do the deed. The table was set. The music was playing. The reflections danced in the water at the edge. And back and forth, 2 waiters bounded back and forth, filling champagne flutes and clearing the plates. And then, of course, there had to be dancing. And so in the early tails and evening gowns, champagne in hand, they danced. Talk about a rubbernecking wreck that almost occurred as cars drove by with their drivers on the way to work. These 12 people were seeking to engage their friend in a celebration of life, her life, their lives, and to celebrate the fact that they were all 12 alive and friends at this very moment in time. They did not know that someone was going to take their picture. But a Washington Post photographer was nearby, saw what was happening, and started clicking his camera. And the rest is history. for this event. It ricocheted all over the country's newspapers like wildfire. It became one of the most popular photographs to look at, to see, to purchase, to put in your home, on the wall of your office, and look at. You could stare at it for hours, but you didn't know much about it other than that. You really didn't know the history of how the picture came to be and who these people were and why they were there. The photographer for the Post wound up working there for 35 years, taking pictures of official Washington, all comings and goings of the government. He had a daughter named Joyce. The photographer's name is Harry. I'm going to refer to them in this podcast as Harry and Joyce because I really can't pronounce their last names, even the married name of Joyce, very well. So Harry took this picture, went on to an illustrious career, and then suddenly, at the age of 69, dies from a heart attack. His daughter's 24. At the home, after the funeral services in the days that followed, they were going through her father's things, and Joyce finds some of his pictures and photographs, which is not unusual because that's what he did for his work. But she came across this picture, the Breakfast Club, and she was aware of it. And it struck her, and she couldn't get it out of her mind. Later on, she is working in Washington and makes a speech to a neighbor's village group in Northwest Washington, a local nonprofit that was supporting seniors in the district. And she queued up her presentation. An email from the event organizer pinged her inbox. A woman in the audience, a senior now, had recognized her name and was familiar with her father's work as a picture photographer taker. She was one of the 12 young people in the 1970s who had attended this breakfast. This is 2023. Suffice it to say that this chance meeting of the guest friend at the breakfast, the daughter of the photographer, leads to a meeting of all of the young people, now older, to talk about the picture. Janet lived a few more years till she was 35 before breast cancer took her life in April of 1982. Others passed away as well. We're now down to 6. So it was probably good that these 12 people, these 12 friends, embraced life while they had it. They didn't postpone it. They didn't say, wait till next year. They did it then. When they were concerned about the cost of the breakfast, they raised the money, $2,700 in 1974, worth almost $13,000 in today's money due to inflation. That's what they did for their friend. They wanted to celebrate life because they wouldn't have this moment forever. Joyce, the photographer's daughter, had an idea. She went to the Washington Post and met up with a friend of her dad's who sort of helped her along the way. And she asked the Post to help them take another picture, another photograph of another breakfast on the mall, the same location on its 50th anniversary. And so just 2 days later, July the 21st in 2024, there was a reunion, almost 50 years to the date. Isn't that something? The chairs are similar to the same as before. There's a long table with a white tablecloth. There's no champagne. There's no string quartet. There's no dancing. There are, though, empty chairs. Which reminds us, as we can know when we take family and group pictures, that someday there will be a missing person. And so therefore, you got to take it while you have it. But it wasn't all sad and gloom that day because the chairs were soon filled by spouses and children, and they filled the chairs up with teeming life once again as the cycle of life continued. It was catered, pastries, not as fancy, not as costly. And then it was over, just like that. They weren't ready to go. They weren't ready to disband, though it was time for them to leave the mall. And so they went to a nearby restaurant and sat around tables. And there they drank and toasted each other with champagne and toasted all those who were gone. Dottie Whalen, the young girl who took in two strangers, Carolyn Busser and Janet Harley, married one of the men of the group. They raised a family. In 2024, she was 78 years old. She told everyone that she had named a child after her friend, Janet. This was in the summer. This was not about New Year's. And yet, it seems to me there's great meaning here. Thinking about New Year's resolutions, where, as you know, in the time-honored tradition, we all sit down with pen and paper or computer and scream and make notes, jot down. We number them, we date it, the things we want to do in the coming year. Some we do, most we do not. I have looked at some of my own past years. I found two recently, 2016 and 2022. Those are the only two I found. I'm sure there are others, some I just can't locate them. Most of the stuff that's there is pretty good. It's all honorable. It's all good to do. It's just the problem is I really didn't accomplish many of them. Exercise, playing the piano more, learning how to play the piano better, writing another book, All great intentions, all good things to do, still left on the drafting room floor. I'm struck by a photograph that you might see if you access this story online in the Washington Post. It's on one side of the paper, it's the style section of the Washington Post with the large picture of the 12 having breakfast, with the headline on the mall, breakfast for 12 at dawn. Over to the right, years later, a small article in pictures saying, own a piece of history. Buy this picture or photograph. Gives the prices a picture of man on the moon, President Reagan at his desk in the White House, John F. Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower together in 1960, Eleanor Roosevelt in the 1930s, Martin Luther King Jr. on the National Mall in 1963, and a picture of the group that was taken on July the 19th, 1974, as one of the pieces of history. These people, the group, did not intend to make history. What they intended to do was to have a good time, to celebrate their friend's life, to show warm, unconditional love for her. And they did that. And they stayed together as a group. But as time goes on, people and events change. We get older. And they didn't talk about this particular event quite as much. They certainly did not intend or think that any of them would ever become known to the general public. But now there's stories out there. It just happened like that. Which leads me to think and to suggest that we don't know, not any of us know, when we might do something good that has a ripple effect beyond all that we could have ever imagined. So I think this new year, a good New Year's resolution, at least for me, is to try to be a better person, try to be a better friend, try to do something at least once this year that is somewhat outlandish. It's over the top. It's beyond the pale, that nobody would see coming, that was really nice and fun and just amazing. Who knows? Maybe it won't have any effect at all, but you never know. You should never say never. And so rather than asking to do specific necessary things, good things all in our New Year's resolutions, think big just once. Think big about what you would like this New Year to be. Go look at the Washington Post online. Put in your Google machine, Washington Post, breakfast on the mall. You can add the word picture if you like. Either way, it will take you to a page where there is a link that you can click on, and you can read what I've just talked about today, a story by Marissa J, published by the Washington Post, the background story of a famous photograph that no one ever thought would be famous. And then resolve to yourself, I'd like to be one of them. I'd like to do that. If I can't go have breakfast on the mall, I'd like to order it. I'd like to set it up. Heck, I'd like to drive one of the limousines or the horse and buggy carriage that Janet's boyfriend used to take her to breakfast that morning. I'd like to be one of the two waiters who ordered the pictures themselves. I'd like to be a part of that. I'd like to be a part of something bigger than I am, that's more fun than I've ever done before, and that I will never do again. That's my New Year's resolution. It's not half bad. I hope you've enjoyed this today. I have enjoyed researching this, putting it together, and wish for you a happy new year. And I hope to see you again soon on my next podcast on grit, stories of resilience. Goodbye.